Sojourner Truth, a woman of great courage. Though it may not be a problem now, back then women and blacks were not considered equal. Sojourner Truth filled the gap when she acted as the first African American woman activist. She stood against slavery and wanted equal rights for all women, whatever skin tone. Sojourner Truth will forever be remembered as a legend. Sojourner Truth. As a black woman in the 17th and 18th centuries, Sojourner Truth faced many difficulties. The hardest problem she faced was probably the fact that she was a slave. Sojourner Truth was born into slavery as Isabella Baumfree around the year 1797. She was one of 13 children. She was born to Elizabeth and James Baumfree in Swarterkill, Ulster County, upstate New York. Her master was Colonel Johannes Hardenberg. Colonel Hardenberg was Dutch, therefore he spoke Dutch, and so did all of his slaves, including Isabella and her family. Colonel Hardenberg died while Isabella was still a baby, so their new master was his son, Charles Hardenberg. In 1806, Charles died, and so Isabella was put up for auction. It took a lot for them to sell Isabella. For a 9-year-old, Isabella was very tall and lanky, but it was hard to sell her because she spoke no English. Finally, they sold her to a Mr. John Neely, but he only accepted her after they offered a herd of sheep with her as well. She was sold for $100. Life at the Neelys was hard for Isabella because she was constantly beat by not only her owner, but by her owner's wife as well. The owner's wife was very frustrated because Isabella could not speak English, so when she asked for one thing, Isabella gave her another. Isabella later said that once she was beat with metal rods and hot embers bound together by wires. Some of the other slaves told her to steer clear of Mrs. Neely, but she found that virtually impossible because Mrs. Neely was always around. It was then when she began to look to God for help and assistance. When her father was freed and had heard about the harsh treatment shown to Isabella, he convinced the tavern owner, Martinus Shriver, to buy Isabella. He bought her for the price of $105. When Isabella lived with the Shrivers, she was no longer beaten or treated like a slave. The Shriver's home was a very relaxed environment. She often would sit and dwell on God's word. She constantly prayed with the Shrivers. Life with the Dumonts. In 1810, Isabella was sold again to John Dumont for $175. Mrs. Dumont, as Mrs. Neely had been, was very mean and hostile to Isabella. Though Mr. Dumont took a liking to Isabella, Mrs. Dumont felt differently. Sometimes Mrs. Dumont would tell Isabella to wash potatoes, but when she boiled the potatoes, the water was always dirty. Mrs. Dumont began to accuse her of not washing them properly. Isabella would always defend herself, saying that she cleaned them very well, and when she boiled them in water, the water was clear, but it was always after Isabella left the kitchen that the water was dirty. One day, a daughter of the Dumonts told Isabella that she had a hunch. She said that she thought it was a servant who had been sabotaging her work, so they made a plan to catch her in action. After Isabella washed and boiled the potatoes, the daughter would wait and watch to see who was dirtying the water. The results had been just as they thought. She reported that she saw a servant come in and dump the ash into the pot of potatoes. She later reported the servant and she was punished. Isabella began to grow a large sense of respect for Mr. Dumont. She saw him as an all-knowing and all-seeing master. She began to work very hard for Mr. Dumont. She worked all day and long nights. She worked until all of her energy was gone and she had nothing more to give. Mr. Dumont was very happy with Isabella, but the other slaves grew jealous. They couldn't possibly understand why a slave would be that obedient. They soon persuaded her to act as the other slaves. Even though she wasn't respecting Mr. Dumont as much as she had been before, Mr. Dumont was still very happy with her. A man named Robert. While living with the Dumonts, she fell in love with a guy named Robert. Robert was owned by another master named Catlin. Isabella and Robert would often meet up as their relationship grew. When Robert's master heard all about these meetings, he forbid them meeting anymore. He said that he didn't want them having a relationship because if they had children, he would not be able to keep them and make them work for him. Despite Robert's master's directions, they still met. One day, Catlin found out about the meetings and planned to catch them in action. He followed Robert with his son to the Dumont's house. When Robert got to the Dumont's house, he met his master and his master's son there as well. The turnout wasn't pretty. Robert was brutally beaten, It got so bad that Mr. Dumont kicked them out of his house because he didn't want them to kill Robert in his house. Isabella was very discouraged. She had lost the person that she loved and would never see him again. Mr. Dumont then saw that Isabella was still unmarried and had no children, so he introduced her to another slave, Thomas. They were then married and had 5 children. Their names were Diana, Hannah, Elizabeth, Peter, and Sophie. Mr. Dumont became so pleased with Isabella that he offered to set her free 1 year before all the other slaves were supposed to be freed, which was by the age of 30, which was in 1829, but she was freed in 1828. The only condition was that Isabella had to work very hard until then. Isabella worked hard for the next 2 years. When 1828 came, she reminded Mr. Dumont that she was supposed to be free, but he said the deal was off. In anger and frustration, she then ran away to live with the Shrivers. The Kingdom. Isabella later moved to New York with her youngest son, Peter. It was there when she was involved with a religious scandal in which 2 men claimed to be sent from God and were going to start a community called the Kingdom. Isabella was beat and given the hardest work while she lived in the kingdom. The practices of the kingdom were very strange ones. Once he divorced a couple and took her wife as his own because he said that their spirits did not fit together properly. The community earned a large salary on a regular basis, but Matthias, the leader of the kingdom, would use the money for unknown purposes. He was usually dressed lavishly while the kingdom was not so pampered. Eventually, Matthias was caught by the law for a scandal, and the kingdom was no more. Isabella then moved western. In 1851, she gave a speech which she is very well known for. It was called Anti-Woman, and it portrayed how white women were treated better than black women and how they got the finer things in life. That speech touched many people, and though she couldn't read or write, her words reached beyond what any education could teach any person to say. Sojourner Truth helped open the way for other African American women who thought that their situations were impossible, and it taught them to never give up. Today, we remember Sojourner Truth as one of the most influential people this country has ever seen. Though she is no longer on this earth, her legacy stays with us and tells us that where there is a will, there is a way.